Precise, analytical, the weight of evidence, not emotion. Here is a question worth asking carefully. Why were the Crusades described for 9 centuries in textbooks, in films, in political speeches, in the assumptions that shape foreign policy today as wars of faith? As Christian devotion driving 200 years of military campaigns against the Islamic world? The documented record tells a different story. Not a completely different story. Faith was real and faith was present, but it was never the only thing present. At every level of the crusading system, from the Pope who authorized it, to the knight who fought in it, to the merchant who financed it, to the king who permitted it, the documented evidence shows material interests that the religious framework made invisible. Land, money, power, commercial access to the richest trading corridor on Earth, the redirection of European violence away from European targets, the consolidation of papal authority over secular kings. Every one of these interests is documented. Every one was served by the crusading system, and every one was obscured by the language of faith. 1050s to 1090s. To understand why the Crusades happened, you have to understand what Europe looked like in the second half of the 11th century. Because the Crusades were not born in a vacuum. They were born in a crisis. A specific, documented, institutional crisis that the papacy needed to solve. Crisis 1. The investiture controversy. For decades, popes and Holy Roman emperors had been fighting over who held the authority to appoint bishops. This was not a theological debate. It was a power struggle over who controlled the Church's institutional infrastructure across Europe. In 1077, Pope Gregory VII had forced Emperor Henry IV to wait barefoot in the snow at Canossa to beg for the lifting of his excommunication. The papacy had asserted dominance, but the struggle was ongoing. What the Pope needed was a project so large, so spiritually unassailable, that it would place him permanently at the center of European political life. Crisis 2. Feudal violence. Europe was tearing itself apart. The feudal system produced chronic warfare, not between kingdoms, but between local lords, between neighboring fiefs, between families. The Peace of God and Truce of God movements had attempted to reduce the violence by church decree, banning fighting on holy days, protecting clergy and peasants from combat. They had failed. The violence was structural. The system produced armed men faster than the system could employ them. Layer 3. The Crisis 3. The second son problem. Under primogeniture, the inheritance system that gave everything to the firstborn, every noble family in Europe produced surplus younger sons. Men raised for warfare, trained in arms, owning nothing, inheriting nothing, and constituting a permanent, armed, restless population with no economic future and significant capacity for violence. The systems analyst's signature, the gap named. In November 1095, Pope Urban II stood on a platform in a field outside Clermont and delivered the speech that launched the First Crusade. The speech does not survive in a single authoritative version. 5 different chroniclers wrote 5 different accounts, but the common elements tell us what the speech was designed to do. It was designed to redirect the violence of feudal Europe outward, to give the second sons a target, to give the Pope the leadership of a project so sacred that no king could challenge his authority over it. And, yes, to frame the entire operation in the language of faith. The crowd's response has been recorded in one word. Deus vult. God wills it. The First Crusade was born. Outcomes, specific, documented. And here is what it produced. Jerusalem was taken in 1099. The men who took it, younger sons of minor nobles from Normandy, from Lorraine, from Aquitaine, became lords. Bohemond of Taranto, a younger son with no inheritance, became Prince of Antioch. Baldwin of Boulogne, a younger son, became Count of Edessa. Godfrey of Bouillon became advocate of the Holy Sepulchre. The men who had owned nothing in Europe owned kingdoms in the East. The Crusade had solved the second son problem permanently by giving them someone else's land. Jerusalem was taken, and the men who took it, younger sons of minor nobles from Normandy and Lorraine, became lords of territories larger than anything they could have inherited in Europe. The question is, was that the plan? Within a decade of the First Crusade's success, the Italian maritime republics arrived. Venice, Genoa, Pisa. They came not as pilgrims, they came as businessmen. The Levant, the eastern Mediterranean coast, sat at the terminus of the Silk Road, the spice routes, the trade networks that connected China and India to the Mediterranean world. Whoever controlled the ports of the Levant controlled access to the richest commerce on earth. The Crusader states, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Tripoli, were not simply Christian kingdoms. They were, in documented commercial terms, franchise operations. The Italian republics negotiated commercial treaties with the Crusader kings. The terms are preserved in the archives of Venice, Genoa, and Pisa. What they show is illuminating. Venetian merchants in Acre, the Crusader state's largest port, received a permanent commercial quarter. Their own streets, their own church, their own courts operating under Venetian law, their own warehouses. They paid no customs duties. They were exempt from the local legal system. The commercial treaties were more legally detailed than the crusading vows that authorized the expeditions. The commercial contracts have survived in better condition than the religious documents. The merchants were better record keepers than the priests. The spice trade alone, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, generated revenues that dwarfed the agricultural income of the Crusader kingdoms themselves. The Italian republics were not supporting the Crusades out of piety. They were investing. The return on investment is documented in their commercial ledgers. The crusading system had become, by the 1200s, a self-sustaining machine. The Pope issued crusade authorizations, each one accompanied by the sale of indulgences, which generated revenue for the papacy. The kings permitted their nobles to go, removing potential rivals while gaining crusading prestige. The nobles acquired land, governed as feudal territories under Crusader law. The merchants financed the expeditions and acquired trading posts whose commercial value far exceeded the cost of participation. If you're beginning to see the machinery behind the religious language, the land, the money, the institutional power, this channel documents the machinery behind every major conflict. Subscribe. What you've just learned about the Crusades applies to conflicts still happening today. Pivot, every participant benefited. The religious framework ensured that questioning the system meant questioning God. The machinery was invisible because it was sacred. And then, in 1202, Venice built a fleet for the Fourth Crusade. The Crusaders couldn't pay for it. What happened next proved, in a single documented event, what the Crusades had always been about. The Fourth Crusade was authorized by Pope Innocent III in 1198. Its stated purpose was the recovery of Jerusalem. The plan was to sail to Egypt, Saladin's power base, and attack the Ayyubid Sultanate from the south. Venice was contracted to build the fleet. The agreed price was 85,000 marks of silver. It was the largest naval contract in medieval history. The Crusaders could not pay. When the army assembled in Venice in the summer of 1202, they were 34,000 marks short. The fleet was built. The ships sat in the harbor. The army had no other way to reach the Holy Land. And the Doge of Venice, Enrico Dandolo, nearly blind, over 80 years old, and one of the most ruthless commercial operators in Mediterranean history, made his offer. The debt, he said, could be forgiven if the Crusaders would make a small detour. The city of Zara, across the Adriatic, a Christian city, a commercial rival to Venice. If the Crusaders would take Zara for Venice, the debt would be reduced. The Fourth Crusade's first military action was the sacking of a Christian city for Venice's commercial interests. Under the banner of the Cross, Pope Innocent III excommunicated the entire army. And then Dandolo made his second offer. Constantinople, the richest city in the Christian world, the capital of Eastern Christianity, and, crucially, Venice's primary commercial competitor in the Eastern Mediterranean. If the Crusaders would install a friendly emperor in Constantinople, the debt would be forgiven entirely. The crusade could proceed to the Holy Land. The sack measured, letting the facts carry the weight. On the 13th of April, 1204, the army of the Fourth Crusade, wearing crosses, having taken crusading vows, sailing in ships built for the recovery of the Holy Land, breached the walls of Constantinople. What followed was 3 days of looting that has been documented by both Latin and Greek sources as one of the most destructive single events in medieval history. The specifics, not sensationalized, but specific. The Crusaders looted the Hagia Sophia, the largest and most sacred Christian church on earth. They tore gold and silver from the altar. They rode horses into the nave. A contemporary Greek chronicler recorded that a prostitute was placed on the patriarch's throne and sang drinking songs. The libraries, containing manuscripts that represented 1,000 years of accumulated knowledge, were burned or scattered. The bronze horses of the Hippodrome were shipped to Venice, where they still stand on the facade of St. Mark's Basilica. Pope Innocent III initially condemned the sack. Then he accepted it, because the fall of Constantinople temporarily reunited the Eastern and Western churches under papal authority. The Pope forgave the destruction of the greatest Christian city in the world because it expanded his jurisdiction. The institutional logic was, as always, pristine. The Fourth Crusade never reached the Holy Land. Not one soldier set foot in Jerusalem. Not one military action was taken against a Muslim army. The entire expedition, authorized as a crusade to recover the Holy Sepulchre, was spent attacking Christian cities for the commercial and political benefit of Venice and the papacy. The religious framework was not abandoned. It was maintained throughout. Crusading vows intact, crosses on tunics, indulgences in effect, while the army did the opposite of what the framework described. This is the institutional template that survived, not the specific action. No one defends the Fourth Crusade, but the framework, the use of religious language to authorize, motivate, and legitimize action whose documented purposes are political, commercial, and institutional. That framework did not die in 1204. It was adapted. When modern policymakers describe conflicts in the Middle East as religious wars, when Islamic extremism is presented as the sufficient explanation for a conflict whose documented roots include oil politics, colonial borders, and covert intervention, they are using a framework the Crusades invented. The language of faith, covering the documented machinery of interest. The specific interests change. The framework survives. The Crusades were never only about God. They were about God and land and money and power and commerce and institutional authority, simultaneously, inseparably, by documented design. The religious framework was not a conspiracy, it was a system in which every participant's material interest was served, while every participant could sincerely believe they were serving God. The genius of the system was that the two were made indistinguishable. The next time someone describes a conflict as a religious war, remember what the documented record of the original religious wars actually shows. Not cynicism, not the absence of faith, but the presence of something else alongside the faith. Something the faith was designed to make invisible. The next time someone describes a conflict in the Middle East as a religious war, remember what you learned here. The documented record shows what it actually was. If the documented record matters, subscribe. New stories every week. This is how we got here.